And welcome back, listeners, to another episode of the Invisible Threat Podcast. I am your host, Carter Wilcoxson, and what we're doing today is combining 25 amazing past episodes that we've done, and we've explored some of the biggest questions facing the fiduciary profession. We've talked about judgment, discretion, disagreement, the A-fire compass, and why some of the most important risks aren't found in policies or procedures, but in the way decisions are actually formed. This week, we're going to take a moment to look back on those 25 episodes. We've pulled together some of our favorite moments and key insights from the first 25 episodes. Whether you've been with us from the very beginning or just now discovering this amazing podcast, this is a wonderful opportunity to revisit the ideas that have shaped the conversation so far. If one of these highlights stands out to you, I encourage you to go back and watch or listen to the full episode. Each conversation builds on the last, and there's so much more depth behind every insight you'll hear today. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. We hope you enjoy this special highlights episode, and we will see you here next week for a brand new conversation on the Invisible Threat Podcast.
They didn't necessarily agree with the decision that was made. That moment is judgment. In fiduciary work, judgment doesn't appear when people lack knowledge. It appears when knowledgeable people see the same information and the same situation differently, and when they're under pressure. And as we discussed, Carter, this podcast exists to make fiduciary judgment visible. However, it doesn't tell people, our listeners, what the right answer is, but how to examine fiduciary, how they actually think when they disagree, and to orient themselves when the rules stop pointing to a single outcome. And as we discussed, our premise is going to be fairly simple. Disagreement is not failure, it's information. Disagreement is diagnostic, not divisive. What matters is that we just made something visible that usually stays invisible. How roles, ownership, risk, and values collide before a judgment and decision ever gets made.
And most people, right, they never slow down long enough to notice that, right? So hence it remains the invisible threat.
Exactly. Next time, we'll stay right here and start pulling this apart more deliberately. Not to win an argument, but to understand what's actually happening underneath it. This is the essence of the invisible threat. But structure without interpretation becomes mechanical.
Let me ask you something. If every action is defensible, documented, and compliant, what exactly is the risk you're seeing?
The risk is that judgment is being trained to resolve discretionary tension by default.
This is your theory? This is a theoretical?
It's not. When explanations start to sound thinner, when differences stop showing up in the record, when trust officers default to precedent before wrestling with purpose, judgment doesn't disappear. It just becomes harder to see.
We don't want any surprises, Matt.
And neither do we. But sometimes the absence of surprise is the signal.
We need to be careful about how this is characterized in the report.
I agree. And that concern, that instinct to manage how this looks, that's exactly what I want to talk about. Disagreement is information.
That is so well put. And you know, when you just think about your everyday life, you think about disagreement like, let's agree to disagree, right? So what you're actually saying is that disagreement is actually useful if you look at it as being useful.
Absolutely. It's data. If no one disagrees, either the answer was obvious or the disagreement is not safe to voice. And those are very, very different things.
So I think I get it. I think I understand. The danger isn't the disagreement itself, but what about the risk to my reputation, right? The exposure to my staff, if they can't rely on the standards, right? The prudent standards we work so hard to establish.
Yeah. But the danger isn't the risk. The danger is when the disagreement starts to feel like exposure and the system moves to eliminate it instead of examine it. And once you can see it, you don't need the bodyguard. You need stronger judgment. That's the shift. Not technical maturity, judgmental maturity.
And that is so much harder.
It absolutely is. But once the invisible threat becomes visible, the question isn't how to hide from it. It's whether you're willing to grow beyond it. Invisible orientation is danger. That's the invisible threat, as you just said. Disagreement is data.
Most people rush to resolution. We don't. But sometimes the most important thing in the room is the moment before the decision, the moment where the forces shaping judgment are still visible, the moment where deeper questions can still be asked.
The most dangerous assumption in fiduciary judgment is the one that everyone in the room agrees with.
So let's bring this back for the listeners. So nothing's broken, nothing has failed, but something underneath the judgment was never examined.
And that's the part most fiduciary systems never get to. What we're calling the invisible threat. They fix the process, they add policies, they reinforce structure, but they never surface the assumptions. These are all called technical fixes.
And if you can't see the assumptions, you can't understand the underlying cause of the judgment.
And if you can't understand the judgment, you simply just keep on drifting.
Where do you start then? Which is what?
Well, you don't start with just solving.
Most people think the job is to get to an answer. But in fiduciary work, the first job is to understand what is shaping that answer.
And as we've said a lot, if you solve too quickly, meaning if you close too quickly, you actually solve the wrong problem very well.
Yeah, which exacerbates the issue in the first place, right? Solving the wrong problem very well. So what's the first thing I should actually be looking for?
Well, as we mentioned in the last podcast, you're looking for that moment.
Authority was clarified by the regulator, in this case, the SEC, and the joint federal banking agencies, who each issued statements. Capability is assumed by the institution. We custody other assets, we can custody crypto. But the trust company needs to consider all sides. The executive room making the decision needs to allow the tension to hold the moment.
So despite the pressure of the financial advisor to accept the account and custody the crypto assets, that's tough.
It certainly is. But if the moment is not held,
If the room closes too quickly,
then, as we have said, the A-Fighter compass can't guide the fiduciary judgment.
So now we're back in the room. The client's expectations are real. Competitive pressure is real, right? Because we want to retain these assets. We're probably talking to the client like, oh, I can get this taken care of. A regulatory pathway does exist, and that financial advisor is threatening to take the business elsewhere. So what do you do?
the ways fiduciaries orient themselves when judgments get challenging.
So it's not who you are.
It's a tendency of where you go.
Me personally, I'm being objective. I might actually just be defaulting to something out of like history, or like what's the case there?
Habit. It's the place where you feel most comfortable when decisions get challenging. So you're exactly right. In the case of when you think that you're simply applying policy, you might be just defaulting to structure. Or if you think that you're being fair, you're defaulting to empathy. If you think you're managing risk, you could be just defaulting to protection.
So the decision isn't just about the situation, it's about what I'm trying to protect. Same person, different institution, different judgment.
Not just different outcomes, different construction of judgment itself.
And that's the part the industry often misses. We regulate institutions, but we don't always recognize how those structures are shaping the decision maker, the person, the individual making that decision.
So when something goes wrong, obviously we look at the person.
When we should be looking at the system.
That right there, that's a really, really big shift.
It is. Because now the question isn't, was this decision right? It becomes, what produced this decision?
This produces a fiduciary orientation defined by discipline and consistency. The decisions are reliable, processes are followed, outcomes are defensible. There is a cost. When a structure becomes the primary stabilizing force, the judgment can narrow, and the fiduciary, that individual, may begin to rely on what has been done before rather than fully interpreting what the current situation requires. Precedent can become a substitute for reasoning. What might have begun as principled judgment has been shown to become rigid judgment.
Yeah, and I can see where, as we're talking through this, the individual, the human aspect of it, you're trying to balance between what type of humans that we're dealing with judgment versus, what we're accustomed to doing, having that defensible position and staying rigid within that judgment because that's your comfort level. That's kind of like what you've done. But wealth, divorced from the wisdom that created it, is all too often wasted by those who inherit it. And our entire makeup and our mechanism that we have is all about how we need to engage with these households, do family succession planning, and to give these households the ability to create those types of stories, right? Because as the saying goes, you can't take it with you, right? So why don't we do it the most optimal way while you're alive, to your point earlier, Dr. Matt, right? And then secondarily, we make sure that we create the language within the trust document that's now irrevocable, that we can have things like that story you just shared, Joanne, for generations.
You're looking at the document and it's like, can we do this? But then there's this other element of, should we do this? And I think that should we do this is kind of where the different institutions and the different, regulatory bodies, that you're reporting up to have kind of that a little bit more of a, bearing on how you look at that. Should we do this? In addition to, just the beneficiary situations and, all of those factors that you're taking into consideration. But I think it kind of, you're looking at the document first, can we? And then, should we is kind of, to me, the second step of those decisions.
The industry measures outcomes, but not orientation. What does that mean exactly?
Well, outcomes are revenue, right? Number of clients, number of assets under management. number of errors that are produced, the number of exceptions. Those are the outcomes, right? The results of the execution or what's happening. When I'm talking about the orientation is looking at what happens before, right? It's like, how did you exercise the judgment? What was your orientation when you were looking at this? Were you leaning a little bit towards the document itself, right? Were you looking at really trying to understand what the grantor's intent was? Were you looking at policy? Were you looking at precedent? Were you looking at fairness? Were you looking at risk? Were you looking at defensibility? Where was the orientation before the significant fiduciary activity was exercised?
And Lindsay revealed that legality, it certainly is part of it, but it's only the beginning. Can we is the authority. Does the document allow this? Can we do this? That's a simple, I shouldn't say simple, but that's the authority. That's the anchor. Should we is the fiduciary judgment. And those two are not the same thing. The exceptional fiduciary understands grantor intent, consequence, proportionality, future implications, family dynamics, and beneficiary reality. And sometimes the document technically allows something that still does not feel aligned with the spirit of the trust. That's fiduciary tension.
And as we're discussing, Lindsay's quote, "Can we, should we," is essentially my entire dissertation compressed into one sentence. Maybe I should have just talked to her and gotten the entire thing done without the effort, because fiduciary judgment is not exhausted by legality, as Joanne just said. The controls worked, the process worked, the documentation worked, but was the judgment sound? That's where fiduciary risk actually lives. And that's exactly where the traditional risk assessment stops seeing. This is the essence of fiduciary risk. And that's a completely different question.
Or maybe we can take into consideration a beneficiary interpretation. Two beneficiaries present similar requests. One beneficiary out of their trust receives approval. The other beneficiary does not. The files are likely perfectly documented. The committee involved will have followed every procedure, but the real fiduciary work was not the paperwork, not the committee process. The real fiduciary work was the interpretation of the individual or the committee making the decision. And that's the essence of fiduciary risk. As far as I'm aware, there is no risk monitoring that includes this fiduciary risk exposure in its current assessment.
What if fiduciary risk isn't primarily the risk of a bad outcome? What if fiduciary risk is actually the risk that fiduciary judgment becomes distorted?
Distorted. Wait, say that again.
Yeah, so here's the basis of our definition. What if fiduciary risk is the risk that fiduciary judgment becomes distorted? Not the outcome, the judgment process itself.
For those of you listening, that's a very different definition.
It is, because now we're focusing on the formation of judgment rather than the result or the outcome of the judgment.
Think about it. Two trust officers can reach very different conclusions. Both may be acting in good faith. Both may be competent. Both may have followed procedure, but one judgment process may be stronger than the other. One may be more balanced. One may be more complete. One may be more aware of competing considerations. Therefore, one may be less distorted. Fiduciary risk begins where discretion begins, and discretion begins where certainty ends. We're talking about ambiguity, right?
Right. Yeah, ambiguity. So, well, give me an example of that if you don't mind.
Yeah, it's perfect, right? Because we've been talking about AI. Let's use it as an example because, as we're saying, everybody is talking about this right now, but let's bring it directly into the fiduciary industry.
Yeah, well, I mean, everybody's an understatement. So fair enough. Every conference I attend seems to have AI sessions. Literally, it doesn't matter. In the financial services that I've been in for 25 years almost, everybody's talking AI, right? Every publication has AI articles. Every institution seems to be discussing AI, marketing, branding, all of it. It's all about AI all day.
We concluded that experience belongs to an individual. And that's the example that I gave, all those experienced individuals in this industry. And knowledge belongs to a profession.
Yeah, and truth be told, that's really quite a big distinction.
It's a big distinction, and it's an important one because we often use those words interchangeably. We assume that if someone has a lot of experience, the profession automatically possesses that knowledge as well. That is not necessarily true. If that experience remains trapped inside one person, the profession itself does not actually own it. The individual does.
And that's really important, Joanne, as you know, because that's where things become very interesting. Every profession eventually has to answer the same question.
Maybe we've been expecting experience to perform a job that only research can perform.
Carter, another brilliant observation. And once you see that distinction, that we've been expecting experience to do a job that only research can perform, you begin looking at the profession very differently. Not because anything is broken, but because you begin noticing that a function that has never really had a home.
Every profession develops institutions. Some educate, some regulate, some connect practitioners, some preserve professional knowledge. But eventually, somebody has to discover knowledge that doesn't yet exist.
I think we should begin by answering one question and to focus specifically on that because it's what do we really need to know? And that just may sound obvious, but it's one of the most important questions any profession can ask because every profession eventually reaches a point where experience alone is no longer enough. Experience explains the past, and research prepares us for the future. And the bridge between those two is called a research agenda.
And Matt, when most people hear research agenda, they immediately think of universities, academic journals, or dissertations. But that's not what we are talking about here.
Yeah, I agree, Joanne. A research agenda isn't really an academic exercise. In this particular case, it's a professional decision. It answers a very practical question for us. What knowledge does the fiduciary profession need to intentionally create?
Because a file can look complete while the exercise of discretion also remains invisible.
Yeah, that's exactly the problem. Inspect the container without understanding what happened inside it. The profession sees the input, it sees the output. Between them sits the black box. Facts go in and action comes out. And we often label whatever occurred in between as experience or sound fiduciary discretion. But those labels do not explain the process.
Nor does a good outcome prove that the process was sound. A weak process can occasionally produce a good outcome, and a strong process can produce an outcome that later looks unfavorable because circumstances changed or salient facts were missing. If we evaluate discretion only by the outcome, hindsight takes over.
Yeah, so I guess we can't really define good discretion as the results worked out.
Yeah, of course not. And we cannot define it simply as the fiduciary was experienced. Experience matters enormously, but two highly experienced fiduciaries can disagree.
We need to distinguish three things that organizations often collapse into one: measurement, evaluation, and development. Measurement identifies and describes something according to a method, while evaluation applies criteria and reaches a judgment about quality. Development helps a fiduciary or an institution improve its capacity. We may eventually use all three, but if we move directly to evaluation before we know what we are measuring, we can create false precision. And if the first use of a new framework is to grade people, those people will learn to protect themselves from the framework instead of learning from it.
So you said a few things there. I like that false precision, right? But that last point feels super important. If a trust officer thinks the AFIRE framework outlined in our last episode is going to become a performance score, they may start documenting support for all 5 words just to satisfy the review. So, listeners, over these first 25 episodes, one idea has continued to surface. The greatest fiduciary risk are not always the ones that appear in a report, a policy, or a completed file. Sometimes they form quietly in the moment judgment begins. If one of these highlights stood out to you, again, go back and watch the full episode. Each conversation, I can promise you, adds another layer to the framework and the ideas that are designed to build on one another. So please do yourself a favor, check them out. Again, thank you for joining us for this look back at the first 25 episodes of the Invisible Threat podcast. Most organizations move past these moments. We don't. We'll see you next time on the Invisible Threat podcast. Thank you, everybody.